Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Tod Bolsinger. Tod has a PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary and serves as Associate Professor of Leadership Formation and Senior Fellow for the Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. His books include Canoeing the Mountain, the Outreach Magazine Resource of the Year in Pastoral Leadership, and It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian, a Christianity Today Award of Merit recipient. Tod is a frequent speaker, consultant, and blogger. He serves as an executive coach for corporate, nonprofit, educational, and church organizations in transformational leadership. For 17 years, he was a senior pastor of San Clemente Presbyterian Church in San Clemente, California, after serving for 10 years at First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood. Tod and his wife, Beth, have 2 children. So let's welcome Tod to the show. What else would you like folks to know about yourself?
That's a lot, don't you think?
That is a lot, but I usually struggle beyond any more than that reading. So
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about your story of faith, your journey of faith, if you would.
Yeah. So I was raised Roman Catholic. I'm Italian Catholic by background. So I grew up going to church with my folks and with my mother, who was devout. And when I was a teenager, my parents went through a divorce. And a group of folks came alongside me who were part of a youth organization called Youth for Christ. They ran campus life clubs, which is a lot like Young Life. But and it really was the first time I'd ever heard the idea that Jesus wanted to have a relationship with me. I didn't understand that concept.
Yeah.
And it really was radically transformative for me, because especially at a time as a teenager when my family was falling apart, the relationships I had with those folks became really the embodiment of Jesus' care for me, and which led me then to I joined their staff. So I went on staff with Youth for Christ, and I was running high school groups for non-churched kids. And then I got hired by Hollywood Presbyterian Church to be their college director. They sent me to seminary because they said, you're going to run out of those little youth talks you do by Christmas. You should probably learn how to teach the Bible every week. And I ran out of them by Thanksgiving, so I was thrilled. And and that church was amazing. They paid for my master's degree. I just tell every single person, every time I talk about them, I talk about that because they did. My wife and I were able for me to get a PhD. And I ended up going into becoming an ordained Presbyterian pastor and got a PhD, and also started teaching at the seminary level on the side, and eventually went on to work at Fuller Seminary and do a lot of coaching and consulting, and now lead what's called the Church Leadership Institute at Fuller.
Awesome. Can I ask what version of, I've had some Presbyterians on here, but what version of Presbyterian church did you work in?
Yeah, I'm ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. So,
okay.
Yeah, and
cool.
Unfortunately, the Presbyterians have had enough splits over the last generation that is confusing to people. But
yeah, so I had to ask.
I'm in the older version. Yeah.
Yeah, I think an episode that'll air before you, I had someone from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, which is PCUSA, right?
Yeah, it is indeed.
Yeah. Well, cool. Tell us about a spiritual practice or something you recommend or have developed that's been meaningful to you.
Yeah, so I tease my friends. I would tell them that I'm really a Presby Jesuit. I'm a half Presbyterian, half Jesuit. And the most significant spiritual practice of my life is the prayer of examen, which comes out of the Jesuit tradition, which is really where you spend a regular time looking back at your day, looking back at your week, looking back at your year, and from there paying attention to where you were more aware of God's presence and where you were resistant to God's presence. And where did you experience the consolation of God's presence, that comes to us? And where did you experience the desolation of rejecting God's presence? And really what St. Ignatius of Loyola, who is the founder of the Jesuits, believed was that the more focused we are upon the presence of God in everyday life, the more God leads and guides us into that life and into kind of meaningful purpose and discernment. So it's probably the single biggest spiritual practice it is the single biggest spiritual practice of my life, the prayer of examine.
Can I ask you, part of my having you on here, part of having so many of my guests on here is just for me to learn from them. So I'm going to ask you, for practical, what does that look like? Like, is that just at the end of your day, like sitting down, taking a few minutes to go over your day?
Actually, for me, what it looks like is every single night when I go to bed, that is my prayer. So sleeping, I fall asleep, reflecting back on the day, conscious of the fact that my day, that the consolation of my day is more tied to my awareness of God's presence in everyday life. And then it comes through a regular practice. Once a week, our family used to have, when our kids were growing up, we had family dinners, and wherever they're home, they're adult kids now, we have family dinners, and we would do an exercise we called high and low, which was really the prayer of examine, where we did that on our week. And my journal is made up of every single time I take a retreat or I get away, I do that on the month or the year. So it's just a repetitive process of always trying to pay attention to, really believing that God's at work in the world, and my job is to pay attention to where God is inviting me into God's work of what our Jewish friends call the healing and the restoring of the world, the tikkumal. So
yeah, that's good. I was recently did a message where I talked about liminal. I always get them backwards. Liminal spaces and thin
places.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Which, if I understand, kind of a similar attitude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about your book. Tod is the author of Tempered Resilience: How Leaders Are Formed in the Crucible of Change. And Tod, I thought it was a lot of fun. I was just thinking about this kind of as a pastor, communicator, and you as an author, how communicators are able to kind of take these little random things and just use them to bring home a bigger, broader example. So I loved how in the book, Tod kind of writes about the image of blacksmithing and applies it to leadership. So I guess I should say, talk about kind of what inspired this book and kind of what your goal is for the book.
Yeah, so I wrote a book that came out in 2015 called Canoeing the Mountains, How Leaders, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. And that book was really about the fact that in a rapidly changing world, the idea that the leader would be the expert is the idea we have to give up. That really leaders are usually not experts. When the world is changing so dramatically, if they try to lead out of their expertise, they will lead out of what is already in the past. Eric Hoffer said, learners inherit the earth, and the learned are beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. And many church leaders have a tendency to be beautifully equipped for a world that is passing away. And so uncharted territory means we are in a place where literally our leadership starts with acknowledging that we don't know what to do next.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to lead the learning, and we're going to have to lead people through experience of loss, like giving up things that have been cherished to them. And that's that process. And what Tempered Resilience was about was exploring that. As I started talking to people more about this, I traveled for 5 years all over the country to 3 other countries. And what I found was the big struggle was when you started trying to take to your own people, to your own congregation, to your own organization, these concepts, they often sabotaged you. They resisted going. It's the same process we see in the Hebrew Scriptures when Moses is taking them out of slavery to the Promised Land. And 6 weeks in, they're saying, yeah, we may have just seen the Red Sea part and all of the Egyptian army killed, and we may be freed, but we're running out of food, and we didn't know we were camping, and we'd like to go back because they might have killed our children, but at least we had leeks and onions for lunch. Yeah. And when people start getting resistant to our leadership, that is soul-sucking.
Yeah.
And leaders need to find resilience to overcome that resistance.
Yeah. So you wrote this, you write in the book kind of early in COVID, yes?
Actually, I finished it before COVID.
Okay.
So I was writing this for 5 years, just about what was happening in the world and in the church before COVID. When COVID hit, it just became even more apparent. And so I went back and added some thoughts about COVID to it.
Yeah. I just thought, boy, this is so applicable in the COVID, even post-COVID context. I want to hear, and this is kind of just for fun, walk me through, if you can. You describe in the book going downtown to this blacksmithing kind of like workshop.
Yeah. My wife and I, my wife's an artist, so she's always up for any kind of artisan work. She's a painter, and she also does encaustic painting, which is with blowtorches and wax and stuff. I mean, if I'm creating something, it's on a keyboard. I'm not very creative at all. But we signed up to take a blacksmithing class in a community in Los Angeles that has not had a horse there in 100 years. But it has a group of artisan blacksmiths, and we literally end up in this like urban neighborhood in this industrial area where there's a group of people who basically teach blacksmithing. And so we took this class, I'm taking 2 of the classes, where before you know it, you are thrown right in front of the fire with very little protection. They give you ear protection. I thought I'd have chain mail or something, and they give you tongs and steel, and the next thing you know, you're blacksmithing. And I thought to myself, that experience is what a leader's experience. They are thrown into the work before they're prepared for it or ready for it. And the experience literally of the kind of transformation that they go through is like the transformation the steel goes through in going from being raw steel to a tempered tool.
Yeah. Now, you kind of alluded to it right there, but from this experience of blacksmithing, you kind of drew out 6 characteristics, 6 main points of the book, and you applied to leadership. And I wanted to talk through these. So you have working, leaders are formed in leading, heeding, strength is forged in self-reflection, holding, vulnerable leadership requires relational security, hammering, stress makes a leader, hewing, if I'm saying that right, resilience takes practice, and then tempering, resilience comes through rhythm of leading and not leading. So let's go back to that first point, so you write, working, leaders are formed in leading, and I wanted to ask about this. How do you contrast this? I can't remember. You contrast this in the book to managing, or maybe I read that into you. But can you tell our listeners just about how leaders are formed in leading and how that differs from like a management approach?
Yeah. So management is a really important tool. I mean, managing means taking care of the things that are entrusted to us. So the scriptures, I mean, I work with Christians, the scriptures are really clear that being a good steward of anything entrusted to you is really important. People, traditions, resources, even in the New Testament, it talks about being entrusted with the mysteries of the gospel. So management is about stewardship. Leadership is where you're taking people where they need to go and want to go and need to be transformed in order to get there, right? And that's why they resist it. So leadership requires transformation. You've got to become different than you are, not just taking care of what you've been given. So the experience of the reason I talk about this in blacksmithing is this is what happens to a leader. So just think about this. The moment you become a leader is right after you were an expert and successful at something that was not leading. So if you're in sales, you're the best salesperson, they make you the sales manager. Now you're in charge of the sales team, right? You're the best speaker, they make you the pastor. Wait a minute, I'm just good at talking. Now I got to be leading a church, right? You're the best. I mean, really, you're the best person at running doing the best program in a nonprofit. Oh, we'll make you the executive director. Now I got to raise money and I got to work with boards and stuff. So what you experience is that experience of going from being an expert to being a learner is the first step that has to happen to become a wise, tempered leader. And so leaders, and that happens when you're leading. And this is what's so painful about it. I teach literally master's degree and doctoral students in leading change. And what's really important is that my doctoral students are all people who are already doing it. And more my master's students are already in ministry too. But what's really clear is, I mean, you can write a paper on how to lead change and you can't do it. It's like writing a paper on the physics of flight and trying to then go be a pilot. And so what we have to do is recognize that the leadership is a skill set that has to be developed and a formation that is developed while you're leading.
So if I'm hearing from you right, I'm studying leadership in a class I'm taking right now, and there's historically there's like the different understandings of leadership as like traits or characteristics that we have within us. Do you think leadership is something more like inherent within the person, or it's like things we can develop as a learner?
It's 100% formed. 100%. But it's like, but just know that there are certain characteristics that make it easier to be formed. So the way to think about this is if you're in a seminary, everybody who goes to seminary and gets in a Master's of Divinity takes a preaching class. Some people are more articulate talkers. They're just better.
Yeah.
But we teach everybody how to be faithful preachers. So your natural gifts can be applied, but I really do believe that leadership is formed, not found.
It reminds me of I was actually used this example in my class. I was thinking about, speaking of the biblical examples, Saul, right?
Yeah.
And then David after him, if I'm remembering correctly. Like Saul was chosen because he was like taller than everybody else.
Yeah, he was tall, good looking, and he fit the prototype. That's what a leader looks like. David was a runt. That wasn't.
Yeah.
And so, literally David's formation as a leader came in his taking care of sheep. What he learned is that he had to be able to take care of a flock. So to this day, we still use the idea of a shepherd as a model for leadership, not pastoral care, leadership. Shepherds were military leaders, but the model is David, who the very first thing he learned is he has to be able to take care of his sheep. And so the best leaders today are people who care for and take care of the people that they lead. My colleague Scott Cormode has a beautiful phrase where he talks about how all leadership starts in the people entrusted to your care. And I think that's the basis of management, and I think that's where leadership begins.
Yeah, I love it. Often in my context, we talk about pastoring a church being like, going to seminary to pastor a church being like, becoming a chef and then running a restaurant. Like, you're a great cook. You can cook any dish, but running a restaurant is often a whole other thing.
Yeah. I actually had an older minister. I was in Scotland, and he said to me, "You keep calling me a leader. I'm not a leader. I'm a minister. I was trained to be a minister." I said, "Well, what do you do?" "I minister to people with the Word of God. I minister to people with their prayers and spirit." I said, "Great. So what is ministry of a community of people who are charged with a mission?" And all of a sudden he looked at me and said, "I've never been trained for that, but that is our call. We are the people who are entrusted with the mission of God in a local community. We are to form the people of God to live out those of us who love God are called to love our neighbor, and the love of neighbor calls us into the mission of God."
All right, I have to ask you a hard question then already. We're already off script. This is one thing I've observed. I come from the mainline context, and my observation has been that I feel like many mainline seminaries train me to be a manager rather than a leader. Do you think this is kind of a hard question, so hopefully I'm not going to get you in trouble. I'll get myself in trouble. Like, do you think that's like a result of like church in general, at least in America, of being like feeling like this is something we could just manage because of things were the same?
So I think I would put it this way: there's a whole history about the history of theological education, and for the last half of a generation, the mental model has been we are people who are teachers and caregivers. So to be a pastor means you lead a people and you teach them the scriptures, you care for their souls, you gather them in worship for the teaching and the care of souls, right? So when you start thinking about that as being a leader of people who actually has to lead the very people of God on the mission, right? The mission of God is led by the people of God in a particular area. When you start taking on the idea that the reason why a church exists, a congregation exists, is to be the embodiment of God's mission in that area. I say it's to answer the prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth
Mm-hmm.
In this particular place on earth, we are the people who are going to carry out and be the answer to that prayer. What that requires is for us to be trained and equipped to lead that mission. What mostly we have done, however, is we have tried to manage institutions or organizations that exist for teaching and pastoral care. So if whoever shows up, we'll make sure you get good services. Somebody calls it the vendor of religious services. And I think that what we're becoming really aware of is that may have been adequate in a past day, like in a day when we call it Christendom Day, where the culture gave us a protected environment. It doesn't work today in the day we're in today.
Yeah. That's a great answer. Much more eloquent than me. I know I had Dwight Shiley on, who you have, I think you cite him in the book here, and he kind of speaks to a great. Similar kind of similar understanding.
Yeah, no, Dwight is actually one of the very best writers about this stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on. I feel like we could stop just on any of these points and talk for the entire time. But next you have heating, strength forged in self-reflection. So talk a little bit about self-reflection and the importance for that as a leader.
Yeah, so one of the ironies, so the goal of this book and the goal of this particular thing is asking the question, how do you form leaders to faithfully, wisely lead through the resistance of our own people toward that mission that God's given us? So the example of becoming a resilient leader is actually one of strength. Like, it's to become strong enough to handle the resistance. But there's another part to it. It's to become tempered. This is the blacksmithing analogy. Mm-hmm. A tempered tool is a tool that is both stronger and more flexible. That's what makes it profoundly different. It's a tool like a chisel that can hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope, to use the phrase of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
So that process of tempering, that process requires a formation process that is different than we've been prepared for. And we have to learn how to do that along the way.
So what I'm hearing is some real intentionality of, like, why am I doing this? How does this fit? Is that too simplistic, or is that get to it?
Well, it's even more than that. The vulnerability. So the way I describe it is, it's like the steel going into the fire, and it has to be in the fire long enough that it actually the molecules start to break down, and it can absorb it's like oozy, it's molten, right? Mm-hmm. The experience of every leader I know, here's the irony, to become stronger, to become temper, and to become wiser, to become more flexible, starts with acknowledging the vulnerability of needing to learn and experience loss. It starts in vulnerability. It's a great irony. Strength comes out of vulnerability, which is really different. Most of us were taught, you're the leader, you got to fake it till you make it. Well, we see a whole bunch of leaders who've been faking it a long time, and they're not just making it, they're crumbling, or they're taking other people down. So there's so I want to challenge that notion and actually say you actually need to lead from an honest vulnerability that is able to, this is the hard part, to able to look at people and say, I believe we're called and that we can do this. I just also know that we're going to have to learn as we go. We're going to make mistakes, and we're going to grow as we go.
Well, that kind of gets into your next point of holding that vulnerable, can't say that, leadership requires relational security.
Yeah. Yeah, so you take the steel out of the fire, it's oozy, you got to put it on an anvil. And the imagery of an anvil, thick, heavy, solid, can hold heat, and is the imagery of the kind of relationships that leaders need to be more resilient and to be wise, to be tempered, resilient leaders. So I talk a lot about the critical nature of an anvil. The anvil is the center of your blacksmithing shop. They gave me an anvil, to use, and I put my name on the anvil. I was in front of a fire, and they gave me some tools, but the anvil was my working space. I want to say that for leaders, your working space, the space for your own transformation, is your capacity to have thick relationships, partners, mentors, and friends, all three. Lots of steady, trustworthy relationships. And again, most leaders think they're supposed to be these solo people out by themselves doing this. And this is trying to be a challenge to that.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview of yours from a podcast of a local pastor near me, Steve Cuss. Actually, it might not have been your interview, but I think it was one of his other interviews. He talked about intentionality of, especially for men, straight white men, we're so want to go it alone, having the intentionality of developing those relationships.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, there is a myth about leaders that leaders are solo. Even if they think about this, we will talk about having solo pastorates.
Mm-hmm.
Solo is not the imagery in the scriptures. I mean, Paul had partners, right? Barnabas and Saul, Paul and Silas, Paul and Timothy. Jesus picked 3 people to be close to him, and then they picked 12. Yeah. Moses had Aaron and Miriam, right? Mm-hmm. It's the imagery of being a sole leader out front is a non-biblical image.
Yeah. Well, this next section, hammering, stress makes a leader, I didn't particularly like reading because I don't like the idea that more stress in some ways is better for me. Talk about that, and I have a follow-up question on that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The very first question you asked me about myself is you asked me my spiritual practices. Mm-hmm. And what I really believe is that the hammers are the spiritual practices that we take on. That's how God shapes us. So if we are open and vulnerable, and if we're in good relationships and that hold us securely, then spiritual practices are like the hammers that shape us into the tool we need to become. And so what's interesting about a hammer and I learned this from talking to the person who leads the blacksmithing class. I did an interview with the president of the blacksmithing community. She told me, every single time you use a hammer to strike the steel, you're not just shaping it, you're adding stress to it. And stress makes it stronger. You're adding the molecules are compacting. So stress makes the leader. It's hammering into it. So what we need are spiritual practices that make us stronger and more flexible. Now, here's the other part. When you take that tool and you start using that tool, so you hammer it into the rock to chisel it, you add more stress to the tool also. So the use of the tool makes you stronger up until the point that it makes you brittle. And that's why eventually we've got to talk about how to get stress out of the leader. So it's not a matter of just relaxing and resting or of working all the time. It's a rhythm of leading and not leading, as we talk about at the end.
Yeah. I was curious, I like to exercise. Is it a similar kind of approach where, I'm putting my body in stress to ultimately strengthen my body?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You can't. I mean, if you said, "Hey, I want to run a marathon," you don't say, "Well, then, for the next 6 months, I'm going to sit here on the couch and store up some energy." Yeah. Right? Instead, what you do is you start running a little bit more every day, and until you build up. And you also don't go and say, "I want to run a marathon, so tomorrow I'm going to go run 26 miles." You instead start building up slowly over time, and that is adding appropriate stress.
Yeah.
St. Ignatius actually called it moderate stress. He said that's what God wants for you to have enough stress so that you continually are being challenged and growing, but not so much that it cripples you or that it causes so much anxiety that you're unable to learn and grow.
Yeah, that's helpful. That hammering really makes sense now as you're saying that. You're not beating yourself to death. Again, going with your metaphor, your image, you're striking your piece of iron with purpose, right?
Yeah. Right. So in the book, one of the things I do is I ask leaders to think about the spiritual practices they've had in their life and think about the fact that when I first became a Christian, like when I first gave myself to Jesus and I said, "Hey, I think I'm going to be a ministry," people said to me, "Hey, look, you need to go to church every week." And I said, "Well, I do. Great." I said, "Well, you need to read the Bible every day." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. I don't think I ever read the Bible." So I started reading the Bible. And you need to pray regularly. So I started praying. Well, by the time I became a pastor, reading the Bible every day was not enough. I needed to do hours of deep study, right? So my spiritual practice about the scripture was really different because I was preaching every week. Now, today, as a person who's leading people to change, my spiritual practices are different. I mean, I don't preach every week.
Mm-hmm.
So what's my role? What's the role of Scripture in my life today? It's different than when I was preaching every week. What's the role of prayer in my life today? It's different as a father with adult children than it was as a single man. So your spiritual practices need to shape you for the calling that you've been given. And in the book, I talk about 4 particular ones that I think resilient leaders need to develop in their lives that sometimes we don't think of as spiritual practices.
Yeah. I was particularly intrigued by, you had a section in the, I think it's in this chapter, where you talk about the Vietnam War example, where the survivor, the POW, being someone who can face the facts, brutal facts, versus an optimist.
Yeah,
and I was
it's
curious
James Stockdale. Yeah, Jim Collins, who's a leadership writer, made famous the story of Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was one of the longest-serving POWs, the highest-ranking POWs in Vietnam. And he was asked the question, who didn't make it through, who was unable to survive? And they said it was the optimists. It was people who sat down and started by saying, hey, don't worry, it's going to be okay. We're going to all be fine. We'll be out of here by Christmas. By the time Easter came around, they were giving up. He said, what you actually need is the capacity to confront the brutal facts without losing hope, which is to look as realistically as possible at the reality of the world and still believe that to confront this is what we are called to do. So where I tie that is the biblical practice of lament.
Yeah.
Lament is where every time we pray a prayer of lament, we read the book of Lamentations, we pray a psalm of lament, we enter into a lament together, we are joining with the places in the world that is groaning for justice and righteousness to be found, and we are saying, yet, O God, we trust you. It's Jesus doing Psalm 22 from the cross. Why have you forsaken me, O God? And yet he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so that process, that prayer process of lament, becomes really important for developing the tenacity and strength to endure.
Yeah. Well, this thing of survival, it gets us into your fifth point of hewing, that resilience takes practice. I don't remember where I got this from. Maybe it was in the chapter, I can't remember. I put in quotations, how can I survive? I don't know if that fits, but that's kind of what I gathered from this chapter. So tell us more about that.
Well, the whole book is around that theme. The very first quote in the book is somebody saying to me, I think I can learn to lead change. I'm not sure I can survive it. So today, when I think about pastors who are in the middle of the pandemic, and they're like, "Look, I didn't sign up for this. This isn't what I signed up to do. I mean, I didn't. Yeah. I mean, I didn't expect to be doing Zoom calls and staying distant from people and arguing over whether wear masks or not. Or this isn't what I mean. This is hard." Well, what the hewing chapter is about is how do you actually lead people through the change process? How do you actually use yourself as a tempered tool to wisely bring transformation? And it's a process. It starts with managing your own reactivity. You have to manage your own emotions so that you don't make it worse. Yeah. And then it takes you through a process of reframing, reorienting, and leading relationally. And the entire point of the process is that the way the lead change starts with self-regulation, like I'm aware of my own emotions, and then it's really honoring the past. We're going to reframe so that we can take what we are and adapt what's important to us, but we're going to reorient it. We're not going to just do stuff the old ways. And then when people start to resist, which they will every single time, that's what we've talked about the whole book, is that what you do is you actually get closer to them. You help them through trust go through a process of their own reframing and reorienting so that we can continue to move forward.
Yeah, I thought that point about reframing was so helpful just from a practical perspective. I mean, I've been someone who's led an old church stuck in their ways, and I think it would have been so much more helpful looking back if I could have done a better job
kind of reframing and tying back in that kind of like, hey, this is an extension of your past ministry.
Yeah.
Where it was so much for them wanting to retain the past. If there was some way to, if I could have done a better job saying, hey, this future ministry fits into what you've done for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things, so I lead the Church Leadership Institute at Fuller, and one of the things we do is we take churches through an 18-month process where they actually learn how to apply this adaptive leadership process through in their own church context. What we have to teach them all the time is your future starts as a healthy adaptation of your actual core DNA, your organizational DNA, your core values. So reframing is really where you help people see that, your way of going forward is actually embedded already in the strengths you have. We just have to find them and adapt them for this day.
Yeah.
And that's a really important concept for people when they understand that, look, our identity has always been about this. And we've always been a people who cared about justice. We've just, somewhere along the way, we stopped doing the work we were called to do. So what would it look like for us to engage that today, right?
Yeah.
Is the question.
Yeah, even in I work in a new church context now, or a very young church context now. I was thinking, even coming out of COVID, I could still kind of do that, even as we reimagine in many ways what church looks like. I can reframe to say, hey, this is what we've been about from the beginning. It's just, we're going to look slightly different now.
Yeah, you put a bunch of people in a room. We do this exercise all the time. Put some people in a room as diverse as your church can be, and ask them to tell stories that make this. Tell stories. What is it that is most important about this church to you? Tell me a story. Who's a hero? What's the best day you ever had? What chokes you up? What made you start coming here and stop church shopping? What is the story? When people start telling stories, what they start realizing really quickly is that those stories are animating and energizing, and those stories are actual values, not what we think we should be. Like, I think whenever you're trying to work on what you should be, you're in a different conversation. You got to start with who you actually are. And when you start with who you are and you say, we want to be the healthiest, most faithful version of who we are, we're not trying to be something else, then what ends up happening over time is you actually can energize that change much better, because people are not as resistant to becoming their best self as feeling like they're being imposed by somebody else into being something they're not.
Yeah. That always goes over well, right? Trying to force change on people from the outside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your last point of tempering. Resilience comes through rhythm of leading and not leading.
Yeah. So in the tempering process, one of the most interesting parts is the very first time I'd ever seen some blacksmiths work, they finished pounding in the tool into shape, and they dropped it into the water. And I remember it was a group of artisan blacksmiths actually in Prague who were just floored. They were really interesting. They were basically creating art for people who were tourists, and it was beautiful. But what they were doing is they were dropping it into the water, and the water would sizzle, and then they would kind of stop, and everybody would applaud. And I thought, oh, that's how you end it. Actually, when you're tempering a tool that's going to be used, not just hung on the wall, but actually used to shape something, you actually have to go through a process of repetitively heating it up and shaping it and letting it cool slowly, and then heating it up again and letting it cool slowly and heating up. And what it's doing is as it cools slowly, it's actually releasing stress. So by the time you're done, this tool is actually stronger than the raw material, and it's also more flexible. And so what I remember this blacksmithing expert taught me, which said, Todd, look, tempering is the halfway point between so soft that you can't use it as a tool, it won't shape anything, and so hard that it becomes brittle, that it'll explode, it'll break. You need it halfway in between. And so the process is adding stress that makes it stronger, and then relieving some of the stress that makes it tempered. And that process is the process of a rhythm. And so, so today I'm doing this with you at I live in California, but I have a little mountain place in Idaho that I go and try to get there a couple times a year, 2 years a year, where my whole purpose for going is to be able to release stress, be in nature, exercise, hike and ski and snowshoe and do stuff like that actually allows me to come back to the work with more centeredness. And so yeah, I finished this podcast and a couple more things at the end of the day today, and I get a few days off. And that process has a regular rhythm. It's built into our rhythms with Sabbath, but I think leaders need to have a regular rhythm where they are not leading. They are doing things that are restoring, helpful, hope-giving, all those kind of things.
So let me ask you a really practical question. I was in conversations all morning in my context with other pastors, and the topic of post-COVID bivocational ministry came up again and again. What practical advice do you have for pastors and leaders when I have a hard time seeing most churches? I can't imagine anything other than coming out of COVID with less resources, more responsibility, and more stress.
Yeah. So the first thing I would do is say, ask the question, gather together a group of people, like who are your leaders, and ask the question, so what is our mission? And for how long are we called to do this mission? If you want to have a church that is going to have an impact for 10 minutes, then do everything you can as hard as you can for 10 minutes. Right? Yeah. If you want to have one that's going to have an impact for 10 generations, then what do you need to build into it today to genuinely and I think one of the parts that's coming out of COVID is that many churches are now going to have to ask the question about what were some of the stuff of the past that we know we have to let go because they're not going to be helpful for us today. And then what do we need to put in the future? And one of the things we're going to put in the future is learning to lead in an uncharted territory is exhausting and difficult. Yeah. So how do we take care of ourselves? How do we have good relationships? How do we be as emotionally healthy as we can be? How do we have a lifetime of service? We're on a long walk toward the promised land. So what kind of resources do we need to make it through this particular wilderness or exile?
Very good. Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. Tod Bolsinger. Todd, you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. So if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What does that day look like? That kind of thing.
Actually, I say this all the time. I usually say bishop, but Pope is even better. I would basically say this. I would say to anybody who's leading, if you are leading and you do not have a therapist, a spiritual director, or a coach, then I'm going to consider that leadership malpractice. Yeah. I think it is malpractice to lead alone. I learned that from my wife, actually, who is a marriage and family therapist, and she told me once, I have supervision for my 15 clients, and you have 1,500 members, and nobody ever asks you anything. And so I started realizing we are expecting people to lead alone. If LeBron James needs a coach to play basketball, you need a coach to lead your congregation. So if I could be in charge of anything, that's what I would decree.
That's a good one. A theologian or historical Christian figure you would want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh, gosh. Oh, my gosh, so many. I would love to meet Dr. King. If I could bring him back and spend time with him and ask him. I mean, I've done a deep dive into Dr. King's oratory and his leadership and his life, and I would cherish that time.
Awesome. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I actually think that history is going to remember this season in the life of the church as one of the low points. Oh. I think that it has not been our finest hour. I think that COVID has revealed and that we are not nearly as profoundly good at witnessing to the reality of Jesus as we wanted to be. That the division of the church at the moment and the political divisions have really become difficult. I hope it'll reveal that we became repentant and humble and that we came out of it stronger than ever. But I think that we have been in a pretty hard time. There's shoots of hope throughout and moments of light in the midst of it. But this has been a really challenging time.
Well, that is my next question. What do you hope for the future? Will that be it?
Well, the biggest hope I have is the number of people who are actually honestly saying, I need to learn to lead all over again. We've got to learn over. It is the humility I see, especially in a generation that is willing. I think I get to spend a lot of my time with younger leaders who are saying we want to learn somehow differently, and we want to be a different kind of people. And so, learners make me hopeful, and I see more people open to learning.
Awesome. Well, where can people find out more about you and get a copy of the book?
Yeah, well, so the book can be found wherever books are sold. The best way to get a hold of me is through. You can actually send a text to change, because I lead change to 66866. Send a text to change to 66866. It gets you connected to the Pree Center, where I'm in charge of the Church Leadership Institute. So change to 66866 or depree.org/church, and that's where all my stuff lives.
All right, I will include that in our show notes. So,
Great.
Todd, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Lauren.
Appreciate the conversation, and I hope and pray that beyond this is restful and relaxing.
Good. Yeah, thank you indeed. Yeah, nice to be with you.
I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, and also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Torn Curtain Arts in partnership with Resonate Media. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit futurechristian.com. If you've enjoyed the show and you think it would be valuable for others to hear, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. That really helps more people find us. Thanks again, and go in peace.